The sons of Fenris. They are forged in the crucible of their unforgiving world. Driven by a relentless thirst for battle and glory, these gray-clad warriors, resembling the primal wolves of old, find their greatest satisfaction in the clash of steel amidst the chaos of war. The Space Wolves are known in their native tongue of Juvik as Vaika Fenrika, or the Wolves of Fenris, and they are amongst the first founding Space Marine legions. At their helm once stood the legendary Primarch Leman Russ, raised to glory by the Emperor himself during the early stages of the Great Crusade. Initially, they were known as the 6th Legion of the Astartes. The Space Wolves are a celebrated chapter, in large part due to their fierce independence and their constant defiance of authority, which has saved the lives of many Imperial citizens. These traits were essential and greatly mirror the brutal and untamed cultures that developed on their homeworld of Fenris. Unlike other chapters, they boldly deviate from the Adeptus Astartes' own codex in their structure and organization, maintaining the traditions of the times of the legions, setting themselves apart from their brethren. In large part, this is due to their near inability to create successor chapters. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the Imperium underwent significant restructuring, and for the Space Marines, this was known as the Second Founding, which led to the division of the Space Wolves into two distinct chapters. The Space Wolves, who continued to follow their own path in defiance of the Codex Astartes, and the newly named Wolf Brothers. However, the latter faced severe challenges due to rampant gene seed mutations, leading to their eventual disbandment. However, now with the advent of the Era Indominus, new successors of the Space Wolves have emerged. Yet some amount of tension within the chapter proper still remains regarding these Primaris Marines, warriors who, although are created through the genetic legacy of Leman Russ himself, seem to be starkly different from the Wolves of Fenris, at times even referred to as being too similar to the sons of Guilliman to be true sons of Russ. Many veterans of the Space Wolves question the legitimacy of these newcomers, to the point that they even question if they are actually the sons of the revered Primarch. Nevertheless, the Great Wolf Logan Grimnar has welcomed them and acknowledged their worth as warriors of the Wolf King's lineage. Throughout the millennia, the Space Wolves have fought with unwavering ferocity in the name of the Emperor and the Imperium, as they currently stand as one of the most renowned Space Marine chapters of the Adeptus Astartes. Their deeds and sagas have resounded across the galaxy through both space and time, which has led to many both loyal members of the Imperium and those who exist without the Emperor's grace to know them for their fierce temperament and their strong preference for close quarters combat. They are renowned to be as stubborn as they are deadly, as these warriors are ever eager to etch their names into the records of war. And so the legends of the Space Wolves have been woven across countless worlds, capturing the imagination of a myriad of Imperial citizens. Their battle honors are so vast and numerous that a single battle scribe would need a lifetime to record them all. Unlike other chapters, the Space Wolves celebrate their victories in a rather unique way, crafting their sagas and tales of valor to be passed down through generations, primarily orally. Their stories are not just records of battles won, but living testaments to the indomitable spirit of the Wolves of Fenris. And so the Space Wolves are a proud and fierce chapter, often driven by an insatiable thirst for glory in all their endeavors. Amongst their fellow Astartes, particularly the Dark Angels, the Space Wolves are perceived as often being overly boastful and rather vainglorious, their methods being seen as too crude, and their desire for renown too excessive for a proper Astartes. However, records have shown that the truth runs deeper. Every Space Wolf aspires for his saga, his personal tale of valor and heroism, to be retold by his brethren long after his death. They wish for their names to be uttered with the same reverence as some hold for their Primarch, Leman Russ. However, something that has often gotten them into bad ways with the Imperium at large is the Space Wolves' active defiance of the Codex Astartes, representing one of the Imperium's most profound deviations from the doctrines of the Codex Astartes, from the doctrines of the Adeptus Astartes. However, this is largely waved away due to the genetic heritage derived from Leman Russ being in essence a double-edged sword, endowing them with a Primarch's keen senses, but also subjecting them to the constant threat of fierce fearsome mutations known as a curse of the Wulfen. This curse can transform warriors into monstrous bestial forms, a dire fate for any son of Fenris. And it is also believed that originally there were no wolves or canines on Fenris, and that those that currently exist on Fenris are just brothers who had fallen to the Wulfen curse, more drastically than others. Organizationally, the chapter pays little heed to the Codex Astartes, holding fast to the traditional structures and practices that saw them through the climactic battle of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy. Visually, the Space Wolves are considered to be one of the more distinct chapters in the Imperium, their armor being a patchwork of intricately crafted talismans, trophies, animal skins, bones, you name it. If they vanquish it in combat, it's most certainly going to have some part of it attached to their armor eventually. However, despite being renowned for their fierce independence, they are incredibly loyal to their packs, which in essence is the Space Wolves term for their Space Marine squads. Every deed a Space Wolf undertakes, every time their squad, or rather their pack, survives, is another verse in their ever ongoing saga, which are not just filled with their triumphs, but also with their failures and their tribulations. Many consider the Space Wolves' rites of initiation into the chapter to be amongst the hardest of any Space Marine chapter. To be accepted as a neophyte, a Space Wolf must face a battle of almost certain death, vanquishing a particular foe, one of the legendary beasts from their planet of Fenris, by themselves. It is only then, if his deeds are worthy, that he will be chosen by the chooser of the slain. In essence, something akin to a Space Marine apothecary, who is said to take them away from their family and begin the induction into their new pack. This marks only the beginning of the journey, and for many, the end point of it, as the gene seed of Leman Russ is so potent that it often overwhelms almost every aspirant, transforming them into the feral creatures known as Wulfen, and or any other manner of wolf-like beast. If they are deemed worthy, they are allowed to advance, as they will continue to face further trials, eventually earning a place amongst the Bloodclaw assault packs. At this stage, a Space Wolf is a brash and reckless warrior, by all accounts, even those of more experienced Space Wolves. But rather than stopping this, their leaders will often stoke this competitive spirit, using the fervor of youth to drive the young wolf of Fenris further and further still into glory. However, time and experience will temper all sons of Russ, eventually crafting them into some of the most elite warriors humanity has ever known, slowly learning to balance their impetuous nature through the wisdom and the sagas of their elders, eventually earning their place amongst the veteran Grey Hunter packs. And thus, the Space Wolves have become renowned across the Imperium and the galaxy itself as some of the most flexible and experienced warriors that the Adeptus Astartes can produce. Under the leadership of their master and their genetic father, Leman Russ, the Space Wolves had carved a bloody path through the stars during the Great Crusade. Despite their fearsome reputation and the independence he and his sons prized, they never strayed far from the shadow of the Emperor, and to many this made them appear as the personal hounds of the Emperor, his lapdogs, if you will. Unlike their brother legions, the Space Wolves were often held back and kept tightly in check by the Imperial court and unleashed almost exclusively at the Emperor's direct commands. As a blunt instrument of retribution, they were often called upon not only to annihilate those who resisted the Imperium's demands for compliance, but also to punish all those who dared question the Emperor's glory or even betray their oaths. This dual role eventually allowed them to become known as the Emperor's executioners, as they were also seemingly responsible, though records of it are obscured to this day, for the slaying of the two missing Space Marine legions. As the long solar decades of war continued, the Space Wolves became increasingly isolated, seen by many as necessary evils and a savage force wielded by the Imperium, not due to desire but due to lack of other options, caused them to gain a rather foul reputation. And by the closing years of the Great Crusade and the ascension of Horus to the rank of War Master, the Space Wolves stood largely apart, a legion respected by some, feared by others, and mistrusted by any of those who were smart enough to be wary of the Wolves of Fenris. However, they would maintain both bonds of camaraderie and respect with certain legions. However, for some unknown reason, they seem to hold a particular disdain for certain other legions, a deep-seated animosity that even even the blind could see through. To some, the Space Wolves were and still are seen as little more than controlled beasts, leashed monsters to be released only when killing is to be done, something simultaneously more than human, yet less than any man, perhaps even less than the worst of the Astartes. Yet the Space Wolves were and still remain indifferent to such judgments. They understand the nature of their purpose with unyielding clarity. They were not builders of empires. They were not sentinels guarding the walls, nor were they soldiers marching in lockstep, nor warriors vying for rank and ceremonial honor. They would not even consider themselves statesmen. They were predators, made and molded to be such by the God Emperor himself, and any who dared stand in their path or fall within their reach would face the severe consequences of the wrath of the wolves of Fenris. The Space Wolves, though rather verbose and bombastic, were noted to not be interested in pomp or circumstance of others. They often saw themselves as the storm at the edge of humanity, ever ready to strike with the ferocity of a pack of wolves descending upon its prey. Before the Great Crusade, Terra, the cradle of humanity, endured a long, bleak isolation as the galaxy was engulfed by nigh impenetrable warp storms that surged violently across the stars, creating barriers that cut off Terra from the rest of the humanity's settled worlds. This tumultuous period was known as the Age of Strife, and it was a rather macabre and bleak chapter in humanity's history. Even the Emperor, with all his foresight and power, was trapped upon Terra, unable to reach out to his scattered children across the stars. His efforts would only be confined to securing humanity's birthplace and readying his armies for the monumental task of reclaiming the galaxy. Bereft of the Emperor's guidance during this grim age, the human worlds spread throughout the galaxy were left vulnerable to Xenos depredation and the nightmarish horrors which emerged from the warp. Many fell into anarchy, chaos, and ultimately despair, as humanity, it seems, stood on the precipice of oblivion, its scattered remains doomed to fade away, and the echoes of humanity lost to time. During this period of isolation, the Emperor embarked on his most ambitious project yet, the creation of 20 transhuman beings known as the Primarchs. These Primarchs are the pinnacle of genetic engineering, each created to be a unique being of extraordinary, nigh unparalleled abilities, both physical and, as Jagatai Khan found out, psychic in origin. Though molded after humanity, these beings were far from ordinary men, possessing a strength, a presence, and a power that marked them as something greater, as the Emperor's very own sons. However, the Primarch project, as it came to be known, was dealt a catastrophic blow by the universe's worst mother. While still in their infancies, the Primarch's incubation pods, housed deep within the Emperor's gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains, were swept up by a great warp disturbance, which gave the Primarch's mother, Erda, the ability to cast out these nascent superhuman beings into the stars through the very bowels of the warp, hell itself. She literally launched her and the Emperor's children into hell. Faced with this setback, the Emperor chose not to replicate the long and arduous project that had created the Primarchs. Instead, he turned his attention to a new solution, one born from the remnants of his earlier work. Using the genetic foundation laid by the creation of the Primarchs project, the Emperor and his team of exceptionally skilled geneticists crafted a set of specially engineered organs derived from the genomes of each Primarch. These organs, designed for the implantation into early adolescent human males, would transform them into formidable warriors and echoes of the Primarchs, there to be known as Adeptus Astartes, or colloquially as the Space Marines. Thus, through the fire and the flames of adversity, the Great Crusade gained its Space Marines, and especially the Space Wolves, who would prove themselves as the Emperor's mightiest tools, a bulwark against the darkness that threatened to consume humanity. The Space Wolves, apart from all their kin, embodied the fierce, untamed spirit of their Primarch the closest, and even without meeting him would carry his legacy of strength and savagery throughout the galaxy. forever leaving their mark on the Imperium's history. Now, to further understand how the Space Wolves would develop, we have to look into their Primarch and his early history, as the saga of Leman Russ begins on the nigh inhospitable death world of Fenris. Here, amidst the biting cold and the unforgiving landscape, his incubation pod plummeted from the heavens, crashing violently into the side of a vast mountain. The brutal environment of Fenris was one of icy storms and deadly predators, which would have spelled a certain death for any other ordinary being, be they child or adult. Yet the Primarchs were far from ordinary humans, and Leman Russ stood apart from his brothers. Emerging from the wreckage, the infant Primarch first encountered a ferocious mother Thunderwolf, who for most would have been the end. But this child was unlike any other, a being of immense strength and primal ferocity. This caused the mother to, instead of seeing him as a meal, recognizing him as a wild spirit as untamed as herself, leading to her choice not to slay him, but to raise him as one of her cubs amongst her pack. This twist of fate would shift history greatly, leading to many of Leman Russ's characteristics becoming more pronounced, and eventually leading to the Fenrisian tale of the Wolf Child. His earliest days were spent in the company of beasts rather than men, and much of what is known about the origins of the Space Wolves and the tales of Leman Russ would be preserved in these early accounts by Gungrul the Elder, a chronicler and contemporary of the ancient Fenrisian king Thregnir, and his epic work would be known as The Ascension of the Wolf King, which provides a vivid portrayal of a pivotal moment in the Primarch's nascent life, and it goes as follows. During one particular brutal hell winter, when the ice storms at Fenris were at their fiercest, a hunting party of Fenrisian tribesmen stumbled upon the wolf child and his pack. Seeing them as nothing more than beasts, the hunters attacked, slaying the mother wolf and many of her cubs with their spears and arrows. However, they were not prepared for what would happen next. The young Primarch, driven by a ferocious blend of grief, rage, and a deep-seated animosity at seeing his kin slain, fought with an almost supernatural fury, as he tore through the warriors with his bare hands, killing dozens of them in a desperate bid to protect his remaining packmates, Ferric and Gri. His strength was beyond anything the tribesmen had ever encountered on the world of Fenris, and his savage determination left them awestruck. At that critical moment, fate seemed to intervene once more. One amongst the hunters with a keen eye, and perhaps a touch of Fenrisian wisdom, realized that the wild creature was not a wolf, but a child, a human in form, if not entirely in spirit, which led to him calling for his fellow warriors to lower their weapons, and slowly they would heed his plea, which led the bloodied and battered youth, still bristling with aggression, standing his ground, fangs bared and ready to strike, choosing then to stay his own wrath, recognizing that the confrontation was, at least for now, at an end. The hunters, uncertain of what to do next with this extraordinary being and his remaining wolf companions, decided to bring them before King Thregnir of the Russ tribe. The aging king and shrewd leader was known for having a rather discerning eye, and with said eye he saw something in the young Primarch that the others did not, a potential that transcended the ordinary. He would then decree that the wolf child would be taken into his household and raised as one of his own, not merely a ward of the tribe, but as a true Fenrisian, a warrior who was destined for greatness. This was a decision that left many amongst his tribe baffled, as they viewed the boy as nothing more than a wild beast. Yet time would prove the king and his choice to be wise beyond measure, as under his guidance the young Primarch would not only grow in strength, but in skill and in understanding, as he would master what it meant to be a leader, a warrior, and ultimately the Wolf King of Fenris. For the first time in his life, Leman Russ had found himself amongst his own kind, humanity, stripped of the wild and primal existence he had known with the Thunderwolves since the inception of his earliest memories. This led to him quickly adapting to the ways of the Fenrisian people. It seemed, at least to them, that the young Primarch had an uncanny ability to learn and excel, as he swiftly mastered the art of the warrior, becoming adept in wielding the primitive iron axes and swords of the Fenrisian people, demonstrating both a strength and finesse unlike any other, and possessing an infectious laughter and booming voice that could bellow out even the mightiest song, even though he was renowned for being tone deaf in every sense of the word. It quickly became clear to all those who witnessed him that Russ was far more than the feral beast they had initially thought, as he himself slowly began to realize that while more human than wolf, he was superior to both. And this was a realization that not only Russ came about, but those who witnessed him often would come to. This realization, while not lost on others, did not inflate Russ's ego beyond his measure. In one particularly telling episode of his saga, Russ was in a sparring match with the very champion of the King's Guard, and in the sparring match, Russ disarmed his opponent thrice, and instead of pressing on the advantage, he would constantly return the champion's weapons, a gesture that not only demonstrated his unmatched battle prowess, but also his growing and deep understanding of respect and honor. It was in that moment that the king, the ruler of the Russ tribe, silently acknowledged to himself that the young warrior was destined to someday take his place. Russ would then quickly begin to speak in the Fenrisian dialect of Low Gothic, with a commanding eloquence that captivated those who listened to him. One evening, recognizing his exceptional nature and growth, the king bestowed upon him his true name. Rather than the wolf child, he would be known as Leman of the Russ. As Leman Russ matured, he would evolve into an unparalleled warrior, the greatest being within the world of Fenris. His leadership on the battlefield was unmatched, and he led his tribe of warriors to countless victories, 1,000 and more. When the king passed, there was no hesitation in whom would assume the mantle of leadership. Leman of the Russ would ascend to the throne and become the Wolf King at last. His deeds and leadership quickly spread, cementing his reputation as a living legend across the harsh worlds of Fenris. Yet this rise to power and fame would not remain confined to this icy realm, as inevitably news of this extraordinary leader reached the ears of one who had long sought his lost sons, the very emperor of mankind. Unlike many of the other Primarchs, much of what remains of Leman Russ's history is shrouded more in myth and legend than verifiable fact, shaped largely by stories passed down orally through the generations of the Fenrisian tribes. And as time would go on, these tales and feats would become larger than life, to the point that some within the ecclesiarchy would believe these tales have Leman Russ, at least in the hearts and minds of the Fenrisian people, eclipsing even the emperor. It was said by some of the Fenrisian tribes that he could single-handedly turn back entire armies of the king's foes, emerging unscathed from the fiercest battles. It was also claimed that he could uproot massive oak trees with a single hand and break them over his back as if they were mere twigs. Stories spoke of him wrestling the Fenrisian mammoth to the ground and roasting the enormous beasts on large trees to be eaten whole by him for every single meal. Such stories, while grandiose and clearly embellished, solidified his reputation as rightful heir to the planet, leading Leman Russ to take the throne, ruling his world without question. As time unfolded, Leman Russ became fully undisputed as the king of all Fenris, and his reign was marked not only by indomitable strength and martial prowess, but a great wisdom and an unyielding sense of justice, as his judgments were both firm and decisive as his sword arm was, and his authority was unchallenged, as no man nor beast could overcome the Wolf King, and no tribe dared stand against the might of the armies he assembled under his rule, a rule which caused a rare period of peace, brokered between both man and wolf, a truce that was as ferocious as it was fragile, and upheld by his will alone. Russ's court would become a place of both savage beauty and raw power, where only the most formidable warlords across Fenris would be able to gather, and where the fairest maidens sought his favor. The stories of his conquests, in all turns of the phrase, and his deeds would spread like wildfire across the frozen tundras of Fenris, reaching even the most distant corners of his realm. The world's legendary Wolf King, who had risen to unite the fractious warlike tribes of Fenris, did not take long before his legend would reach far beyond the icy world, as upon hearing of these tales, the emperor began his long journey towards Fenris. When the mighty fleets of the God Emperor's great crusade drew near to Fenris, they were met with these extraordinary tales of a feral yet brilliant leader who carved an empire from chaos. These accounts were soon identified by the emperor and his scholars, along with many remembrancers, as those matched matching what stories of the long-lost Primarchs existed. What great joy humanity must have felt as one of the Emperor's long-lost and greatest missing sons was found, a powerful being, already a legend in his own right. With this revelation, the Emperor made himself to descend upon Fenris, and it was so that the vast starships of the Imperium stretched across the skies, and to many of those from Fenris, they appeared to be a fleet of silent giants descending upon their quaint icy world. The Emperor's arrival had come just a few short years after Leman Russ had solidified his rule across the planet and forged his kingdom proper, and in those moments, beneath the cold, unyielding skies of Fenris, the destiny of the Wolf King and his place amongst humanity as a whole was about to be realized. A fateful meeting set between the father of mankind and his feral yet mighty son. The beginning of a new chapter in the Great Crusade was about to be written. Moving on, the early history of the 6th Legion, later to be known as the Space Wolves, was largely held in obscurity deliberately. This veil of silence extends to several of the Proto-Legion's formations, which emerged during the latter stages of the Unification Wars on Terra. This secrecy was rather typical of the precautions surrounding the nascent Legion's Astartes, and it was even more pronounced for the 6th Legion and its two sister legions of the 18th Legion, which would then become known as the Salamanders, and the 20th, which was eventually known as the Alpha Legion. This grouping was often referred to as the Trifoil Legions, and were established to function in relative isolation from the rest, created with purposes known only to the Emperor himself and a select few of his confidants. No doubt Malcador the Sigillite and the great Constantine Valdor. The truth behind the Triad's formation seems to have perished with those who once knew of it. For both the Salamanders and the Space Wolves, there was a stark divergence in their gene-forged capabilities compared to their compatriots, which led to certain uncertainty surrounding the Trefoil Legions, setting them further apart from the other Proto-Legions. In particular, it was rather concerning to many that their initial intake of recruits, around whom a cloud of dark rumors swirled, had rather notable issues. In the case of the 6th Legion, the divergence in the origin and the genetic makeup of its recruit was starkly evident. Surviving records indicate that the individuals were some of the most savage and hyper-violent outcasts of pre-unification Terra, selected in particular with this bias in mind for the Legion. However, unlike other proto-legions, there appeared to be no signs of a unifying strain of warrior culture within the Space Wolves. The selection of the inductees seems to have been done on an individual-by-individual basis, seeming to emphasize diversity rather than homogeny, while other proto-legions such as the 10th, later known as the Iron Hands, and the 15th, later known as the Thousand Sons, bore strong cultural imprints from the warlord empires of Terra. The 6th Legion was in essence a blank slate. Their cohesion was forged not from a shared heritage or history, but through rigorous training and isolation, overseen by the strategos of the Emperor's inner circle. What further distinguished the 6th Legion was the unique nature of their gene seed, though its distinct qualities were not yet as apparent to outside observers. The 6th Legion's progress through the various stages of the initial expansion of the Imperium was noted to be significantly slower than many of its peers. In the earliest years, only the 20th Legion experienced a comparable pace of growth, their origins seemingly also intentionally obscured. Retrospective analysis suggests strongly that this was likely due to the Legion's high fatality rates during the implantation process, a factor attributed to the unstable gene seed of Leman Russ. It was only later through the incorporation of their Primarch's current genetic pattern that this instability was largely mitigated. Due to these complications, like the other Trefoil proto-legions, the 6th Legion was largely held back from full engagements, unlike the Hounds of the Emperor and the Revenant Legion, meaning that even during the later stages of the Unification Wars and the initial reconquest of the the Sol system, they were rarely deployed, if at all. This not only further isolated them from their peers, but also denied them from significant recruitment opportunities that legions involved in key battles and subjugations, such as those of Luna, enjoyed. Paradoxically, this isolation may have spared them from the catastrophic gene seed crisis that almost obliterated the Third Legion, known as the Emperor's Children, and caused severe setbacks to the Fifth, also known as the White Scars, and the issues that would long plague the Ninth Legion, later known as the Blood Angel. It was not until almost a full decade after the Great Crusade had pushed beyond the confines of the Sol system that the Sixth Legion was deployed en masse. Whatever transpired in that preceding decade remains, in essence, lost to all Imperial historians. However, there are hopes that within the libraries, records of the Space Wolves' early history still exist. In the records of the Space Wolves' own history, they note their first great engagement being the compliance of 122, known to its human inhabitants as Delfsvan, and these records are remarkably clear, as the Space Wolves were dispatched from the shadow of the Principa Imperialis. Their great expeditionary fleet would be led by the Emperor himself, a great honor to be sure, as they were deployed at full strength, which looking back on things is remarkably low. Merely 3,500 Astartes, who would all descend upon the world that had met the Imperium's overtures with ruthless violence, which would eventually lead to the devastation of the ruling class of the planet. Since Delfsland had emerged from the Age of Strife relatively intact, and they were noted to have retained a technological advancement unlike many others within the galaxy, and a heavily industrialized society governed by a militarized plutocracy committed to increasing the tangible profits of the world and the political control, marked the planet as one non-compliant, but not due to deviancy or a deep-seated malice, but rather their hubris was what set them against the Imperium and sealed their fate, as they would learn the price of their arrogance, with the Emperor's unleashing of the Sixth Legion upon them, with all the might and the fury of the Wolf King's wrath. In the aftermath of this deployment, the Sixth Legion, now under the command of its first Legion Master, Commander Enoch Rathvin, would face a decisive test, as they would now be left largely to their own devices for the planning and execution of the operation itself, as the Emperor had merely deployed them on the planet, which would function as a crucible meant to forge them into a proper legion. Enoch would then orchestrate a complex multi-vector plane strike assault that focused its fury on the Mansur core, which was the fortified heart of the most influential combine on the planet. The assault would commence under the cover of an intense, near indiscriminate bombardment of the target cities and the outlying areas, pushing in any refugees inwards in order to overwhelm what infrastructure remained. And in the ensuing chaos, the Sixth Legion would execute multiple simultaneous breaches via gunship and drop pod insertion in order to achieve a near total deployment of the forces within a single solar hour, a feat which would leave no room for a strategic reserve. The initial tactical observations made by the Imperial officers noted a seeming resemblance of their tactics to a point of the spear type method, which seemed to mirror that practiced amongst many of the other legions. However, particularly under the auspices of the 16th Legion, led by Horus Lupercal, at the time the only discovered Primarch, depending on the records, because some show that there was another, found mere days after the Primarch scattering, but that is a story for another time. However, what actually unfolded in the Space Wolves assault was something different. A sudden and overwhelming assault, which was designed to cut off attempted counterattacks by the defenders, leading to a quick disintegration of their forces into panicked routes, leaving the beleaguered militia ensnared by the thousands of fleeing civilians previously shifted by the Space Wolves. Faced with not only the assaulting wolves, but a mass exodus of terrified humanity, the Space Wolves' adversaries were met by an even greater ferocity, as the Sixth Legion now smelled the scent of blood in their enemy, which incited them to intensify their assault greatly, as the entirety of the Legion descended upon the Messner core with a relentless savagery which the human defenders of the world had been unready for, and the ensuing carnage was utterly unparalleled. Debate remains amongst historians to this day whether during this moment of violence the Legion's command lost control of its warriors, if only for a brief time. or if Enoch, the commander of the 6th, did not immediately curb his force's bloodlust intentionally. By the time the city's surrender, the streets of the planet had been painted crimson with the blood not only of its warriors, but of its peaceful inhabitants, a grim testament to the ends of ferocity the 6th Legion was willing to go to in order to accomplish their mission. The annihilation of the Masonic Corps would serve its intended purpose, as the leaders of the planet's remaining combines witnessed their future fate through the death of their most powerful peer. They would soon realize the futility of any further resistance, as the planet was now chastened and kowtowed into capitulating to the Imperium's rule. While the cost of human lives within the Masonic Corps was staggering and quite frankly appalling, it was relatively small in comparison to compliance operations done by such legions as the Revenants and the Hounds of the Emperor, also known as the Warhounds, who were often known as raising entire world into submission. By comparison, the conduct of the 6th Legion during this operation merely stirred slight unease within the Imperium's hierarchy. Unease not due to the results achieved, as the planet was fully compliant in a remarkably short amount of time, but rather due to the apparent lack of discipline of yet another legion, as more and more of the Emperor's warriors seemed to be monsters in human skin rather than proper exemplars of humanity. Despite this discomfort, the Emperor found the 6th Legion's performance to be acceptable and even commendable, deeming them worthy of a greater responsibility. In recognition of their effectiveness, Expeditionary Fleet 115 was assigned to the 6th Legion, although it would still be nominally affiliated with the core of the mighty Principia Imperialis. This mighty fleet would be allowed to operate with a significant degree of autonomy, as long as it completed its tasks diligently, as it would be complete with its own tenders and escort craft, along with a myriad of other warships not officially recognized as part of the fleet. At that time, this anomaly would mark the beginning of the Space Wolves' privileged position within the Emperor's finest. For a subsequent 12 standard years, the 6th Legion, now a prominent fleet in the command of a significant portion of the Great Crusade, continued to carve its path across the galaxy, its numbers growing steadily, reaching approximately 5,000 Astartes at the Battle of Hintex, and swelling to 7,000 by the outset of the Relvos landing campaign. Despite this growth, the 6th Legion remained relatively modest in size by comparison to its peers. In contrast, the Luna Wolves and the Dark Angels boasted numbers 3 to 4 times greater, respectively. Consequently, the 6th Legion often operated in conjunction with other legions and large Imperialis auxiliary forces during major campaigns. Alternatively, they would be entrusted with smaller yet highly demanding shock assault missions. Throughout this period of time, the Legion distinguished itself amongst its peers through its specialized capabilities in rapid and decisive operations. It excelled in conducting swift hunter-killer missions. Particularly, they were lauded to be incredible in urban combat situations, and in particular, they were rather proficient at executing punitive actions such as quelling rebellions and short-term reprisals before another much larger legion was able to handle the main front of conquest. These tasks, at least for the time, would seem well suited to the legion's strengths and sensibilities, as Commander Enoch frequently sought such assignments for his forces. Interestingly, it was during these times when many other legions began adopting distinctive liveries and developing martial traditions. However, unlike them, the 6th Legion maintained a remarkably austere appearance, as their armor and insignia remained largely unadorned, with modifications being limited to denoting combat roles and tactical divisions. And while rather different than the current Wolves of Fenris, this was a deliberate choice to maintain minimalism in order to set themselves apart from their increasingly elaborate and symbolically armored contemporaries, as the 6th Legion preferred to focus on martial efficiency over ceremonial grandeur. Amongst the 6th Legion's operational structure, one notable element came to its head: its disciplinary corps, particularly its consul oppressorari, who wielded the power over life and death when involving their fellow Astartes. This authority would be symbolized by the twin flame blade insignia of the Sangusta, and it was an icon which was at least in partial usage at the time by the disciplinary master and the Prosvite's corps of the Imperial militia, as it seems that even back then the Space Wolves had begun to form a bond with their human compatriots. In these early years of the Great Crusade, many would note the blend of feral aggression and unchecked ferocity that the Sixth was becoming rather synonymous with, as they would become known as having a rather strong inclination to extreme measures, which would often lead to greater and greater reliances on their own disciplinary corps, which were significantly more necessary than that of other legions, with only the 12th Legion potentially surpassing them in that regard. The role of the disciplinary corps within their legion seemed almost necessary in order to retain any order within their ranks, both within and outside of combat. These units were tasked with enforcing obedience and preventing the circumvention of orders passed down by the hierarchy, in essence a role similar to that of a commissar, with a similar outcome if enough disobedience was spotted. The Council Oppressori would be made up of the most mentally stable, and those veterans who were members of the 6th Legion and followed orders would end up being marked by a distinctive emblem, setting them apart from every other battle brother within the Legion, as they would stand as vivid examples, in particular after the Moloran Revolt, which occurred following a recent imperial compliance in the world of Moloran, as its forces rebelled against the Imperium's rules, prompting a response from the 6th Legion's 8th Company. What began as a precision strike with relative low necessity for the Oppressori quickly escalated into widespread and uncouth violence. The Space Marines that were sent in the relentless assault endangered the very survival of the planet's infrastructure and the segments of the population which had not rebelled, forcing the disciplinary corps's hand and having to intervene through rather violent methods in order to restore order, saving the remaining populace in the city, albeit at the cost of numerous executions of Astartes. To many, this marked the necessity to find this legion's sire as soon as possible. By the second decade of the Great Crusade, the 6th Legion's reputation within the wider imperial forces would continue to erode, becoming decisively mixed. Although the records of their victories were rather impressive, with numerous battle honors to their name, they would be frequently criticized for their indiscriminate collateral damage and high civilian casualties of their campaigns, as rumors circled about of the Legion's brutality and their perceived affinity for excessive violence, particularly against those weaker than them, the human populations of the worlds they were supposed to bring under compliance. Once again, putting them in the minds of many within the company of both the Warhounds and the Revenant Legion. In these early stages, before any impact from the Fenrisian culture and the eventual emergence of the Canis Helix gene seed mutation, there were already signs of a rather bestial nature amongst the 6th Legion and their warriors. These early indications, however, would not be as pronounced as they would later become, which could be due to the large amount of executions necessitated by the Legion's own recurring plague of internal strife, as reports suggested that the strength of its officers was often overshadowed by the need to establish authority constantly. Factionalism and internal violence within the ranks was reportedly all too common, a stark contrast to the more disciplined legions. And while most Primarchs had yet to assert their influence within the legions, the 8th Legion, for instance, was beginning to garner a rather notable reputation as the Emperor's agents of fear and terror. In this context, the 6th Legion's perceived unnecessary savagery was often likened to that of the Night Lords, raising rather crucial concerns amongst the Great Crusade's human hierarchy, as these were seen as warnings that the Legion's unrestrained aggression could lead to uncontrollable behavior being aimed at their own allies, especially since they were not controlled by a Primarch. However, the most staggering criticism directed at the 6th Legion was a notable desire and eagerness that they had to pursue and assault already defeated and surrendering enemies, particularly when they had already given a farewell to arms or were in the process of fleeing to medical encampments. This would lead to the Space Wolves gaining their first moniker, and it was one of rather derisive intent. They would become known as the Rout, evoking the images of jackals and other such beasts from Terra's arid wastelands, as many would suggest that the 6th Legion preferred to prey on already weakened foes, or those who had been exhausted by others. However, there were other comparisons, those to the Warhounds. However, unlike the Warhounds, who were celebrated for their ferocity in battle and noted for their disciplined and honorable conduct, the Space Wolves were not. Ironically, the comparison between the Space Wolves and the Warhounds would seem to flip as the legions followed divergent paths after the discovery of their respective Primarchs, whose influences on their future were greater than the influences that the legions themselves had already had. Eventually, the Emperor would rediscover the Wolf King. And so we find ourselves back at the rediscovery of the Primarch Leman Russ. And unlike the return of Horus, the supposed first Primarch, there are only certain things that would become known, as Leman Russ was the second Primarch to appear at the Emperor's side exclusively, emerging from the death world of Fenris a few standard years before the Emperor's discovery of Ferris Manus on Medusa. Fenris itself, the Emperor noted, was a planet steeped in ancient mystery and legend, which was fortunate since it also meant that they had kept some of the best records of the ancient star charts, which dated back to the Dark Age of technology. And with the discovery of the Primarch, the Fenrisian sagas would recount that the Emperor, in the guise of a plain robe, cloaked in psychic runes designed to confuse and confound, arrived at the Hall of the Great Russ, which, despite the Emperor's great and godly presence, was initially unrecognized by the natives and Russ's own Fenrisian wolves, who, however, would recoil from the strange visitor for some reason unknown to them, explaining that his own submission would not come without a forthcoming trial of strength. And as this mysterious visitor approached the gnarled wooden throne of the Wolf King, and observing Russ's procession over the grand feast that occurred that night, Russ would issue a challenge. The terms set by Russ went as follows. Should the visitor win, he would be granted the honor of drinking at Russ's right hand during the feast. Should he fail, he would serve Russ for a year. The stranger, undeterred, accepted the challenge. Russ's first contest was that of consumption. He proposed an eating competition, a fitting challenge given the occasion. The Emperor, despite consuming an impressive amount of food, was outmatched by Russ, who had already devoured 3 entire Arkosh by the time the Emperor had looked up, leading to the first loss of a challenge. Undeterred, Russ would escalate the contest to a drinking competition. The Emperor, tackling the strong Fenrisian mead with fervor, quickly consumed 6 barrels, only to find that Russ had already emptied the entirety of the supply. Again, the Emperor faced defeat. Anger would then be sparked in Russ's eyes, as he was accused of being a drunkard and a glutton, with no more to offer than indulging in exercises of boasting and excess. For the final challenge, Russ boldly claimed that he could defeat the Emperor in combat, leading to the court falling to silence as Russ, angered by the statements, drew his sword and mounted the banquet table. The Emperor, discarding his cloak, revealed himself in his true form, a towering figure in Baroque golden power armor, who would then engage in combat. The Emperor, now wielding his great power claw, struck a decisive blow that felled Russ. When Leman Russ regained consciousness within the hour, he acknowledged defeat with a bloodied smile and a broken fang, and with a solemn oath he would pledge his fealty to the Emperor of mankind, recognizing him as his true father and his one and only sovereign. From here, Russ would join the Great Crusade.